Good evening. This is Christian. I hope you can hear me. I'm here this evening to talk to you about an interesting street. That's my face, by the way, if you don't already know me. Uh, I'm I'm trying to figure if I'm getting this done right. That's why I'm a bit hesitant. There seems to have changed some rules. Here to talk to you about a street downtown which you probably have seen or passed and thought nothing of it, but it's actually a pretty amazing street. So it's called Torrance Street. Torrance, Torrance. And if you know Mountain and Saint Antoine, which is what I'm showing you on Google Street View, it's of course it's huge now. It's the Bell Center is right at this corner. Mountain and Saint Antoine is a famous street, famous for having a lot of black people living down there, as there were a couple of train stations and they were working as porters. So this was a rocking corner. In fact, it was called the corner. That's what the black people were calling it. Blacks of Montreal, the English black community, which is actually quite numerically small, but culturally important. So if you get to the corner of Mountain and Saint Antoine, you go farther down. This little stretch here had a bar called Cafe Saint Michel at the corner, or not quite the corner, but halfway down the block right here, what you're looking at. And Cafe Saint Michel was a legendary place, really important place in Montreal history. And of course, wow, I didn't even see this building. This was an empty lot for about 50 years or whatever, and prior to that it was Rockhead's Paradise, another black bar full of jazz musicians and all sorts of stuff, really lively stuff. This was an amazing corner. It's before my time that it was amazing, but I've studied the history of it, and I always wanted to know specifically about this street called Torrance. Now, if you know Montreal, all of the best streets, the coolest little streets, are these little east-west streets. We all know, sure, Peel and St. Lawrence and St. Denis. All these north-south streets are all emblazoned into our minds, as are the east-west streets, which are basically, you got your Sherbrooke de Maisonneuve, Dorchester, St. Antoine, St. James, Notre Dame, etc. But then they got these little weird streets. Like I lived for many years on a tiny street called Concora. It's now disappeared, and there's quite a lot of them, and they're always really quite fascinating. So I'm going to tell you about the history of this particular street. This is an amazing view of it. Look at that. This is the 1947 aerial view of, right here will be, I don't know if you could see my cursor there. That's the corner of Mountain and Saint Antoine, right? Okay, so this thing here, if you could see my cursor moving, that is Torrance. Now, what's interesting, okay, I don't know what this structure would have been, but I know that there was once a church at the corner of Mountain and Torrance. Okay, so maybe that's an old church building or something else. Now, on the bottom here, you have what was called the St. Antoine Market. And this train station was the Bonaventure train station. I'm seeing that it was opened in 1877. So this bridge it no longer exists. All right, that bridge was the only way to get over the railway tracks. Okay, so there was a bridge at Mountain and another at Guy and a tunnel at Atwater. So if you wanted to go south of Montreal beyond beyond the tracks over to whatever Griffintown or wherever, you had to take one of these routes, and they're kind of cool, these bridges. Hold on, I think I have a picture of these bridges. Okay, so this would be one old photo of that bridge on Mountain. And oops, what did I just do? There's another old photo. I can't tell you right away the year. I'd have to look it up. But that's what you would have had on the corner of St. Antoine. So I'm going to come back to this. So you had the Bonaventure. This little tiny street here was called Bonaventure Street, and I believe that's why the Bonaventure train station was called the Bonaventure, just because of this street. There was a little market here called the St. Antoine Market. So this sort of had a name, but then it was just called St. James. So I believe the address is here, where St. James or St. Jacques is there. They call it. Basically, so this street here was a kind of an equivalent to Torrance. Now, what is interesting, the building that kind of interests me most about Torrance is on the north side here. This one with the big fat roof. Now, I suspect that this was a part of the old mansion that once was known in the area. Okay, so I'm going to talk about that in a second. So, mountain for one block over to, I guess it was called Aqueduct, and now it's called Lucian Alley, which is basically Crescent Street, Crescent south of Dorchester. So it's called Lucian Alley, and so basically this street Torrance is only about 350 feet long, but as you can see, it was crowded. There was a lot of places, and I believe some of these places are quite big. So a lot of doors in these places. Now, before I switch out of this, I just wanted to point out that I guess this is called a Little Burgundy now, and it's kind of known as a black neighborhood. And well, of course, as I mentioned earlier, it was a lot of the train porters, not only from the Bonaventure station, but also from the nearby Windsor station. So a lot of black. That's where the black men were getting their work as train porters, and so they lived nearby in this area. And the thing I wanted to mention, which I find really quite incredible, is that this area was mostly called Saint Antoine Street area back then. It wasn't really called Little Burgundy until like the 60s, I believe. And some of the great Irish crime clans grew up in this area, so it was really a hotbed of crime. You had the Maguires, the Johnstons, the Ashtons, and many other, splashy, high profile criminals. So you see, once again, I'm gonna come back to this building, which intrigues me. Okay, so um, that's a picture of the Bonaventure train station, which obviously was I don't know the year it was demolished. It was the 50s or 60s, but the railway tracks leading up to the station, they were all obviously pulled up at the same time, but that underneath remained just a big muddy thing. So you'd walk over that bridge and you would just see mud underneath. That was all you'd see. And they eventually got rid of the bridge. So you just walk down mountain and you don't have to worry about any bridge anymore. Now, what I find fascinating about this street Torrance is it once had this magnificent mansion. It was called Saint Antoine Hall. That was the name of the mansion. It was on Saint Antoine Street, but the back door would have been on Torrance. Okay, so who built this? Some guy named John Torrance, and he was an interesting character because he made a ton of money. I think he was involved in shipping and importing, and I believe he had tea coming into the city and made a ton of money on that. You don't really hear about John Torrance anymore, probably because he didn't really name anything after himself. He didn't endow anything in particular. There's a beautiful picture of the John Torrance's mansion that would have been backing onto Torrance Street. Of course, there was no neighbors back then. I have the year somewhere. I believe it was built in 1818, and I couldn't find a date that it was demolished, but I believe I saw a reference in 1960 saying that it was modified. So I believe that the same mansion was used as workers' housing, a working class housing on Torrance Street. So that's the very same street that I showed you earlier, Torrance. It employed the very building. So I mean, John Torrance has had 10 kids, and he was from Scotland. He was Presbyterian, but he switched over to Methodism. So he was best known for having gardens. You would have, he'd invite people over to his garden festivals and stuff. So that was way early days. I mean, even the old timers don't really remember the Saint Antoine Hall. Okay, so I should mention as well, I wrote a little thing on this on Coolopolis. It was John Torrance initially lived at the corner of St. Lawrence and Sherbrooke, and that's a picture of the building. And what the heck is this? Oops, it's a very small picture, but you could see that that is where the gas station at St. Lawrence and Sherbrooke now stands, and this mansion was quite an interesting thing. He moved out of it and moved on to St. Antoine Street, and it was the Molson family who took that over. And of course, it's long, long gone. As I mentioned, if you look on my page on Coolopolis, you'll see a long list of West End gang criminals, and many of these guys had a foothold in. Were from Little Burgundy slash the Saint Antoine Street area around right around Torrance. There's Johnny McGuire being one of them. I'm endlessly fascinated by these guys. So here's a map. Okay, as you could see, Mountain Street. Once again, Mountain was an important street because if you wanted to get in and out of the city, you would hop on Mountain or downtown area to the south. You would use Mountain. Okay, so what I did is I simply went on to newspapers.com and searched Torrance Street. Okay, so what I searched to the Montreal Gazette, and now they have the Montreal Star as well. So the Montreal Star is a very cool addition, and so I can just by entering a Torrance Street, I can find every thing that ever happened, pretty much, that made it to print on Torrance Street. So here's a story about Torrance Street. A guy, a taxi driver, 52 years old, Henri Levesque. He was driving. He was robbed and thrown in the trunk of his own taxi cab, and it was left on Torrance Street. By this point, 1969, Torrance was pretty much an empty street. It had pretty much largely been demolished. If you look at the history of demolitions in Montreal, they didn't ever really come out and say we're going to do slum clearance, but they certainly demolished large sections of St. Henry, Little Burgundy, and other places. So my hypothesis, which I'm eventually going to get to, is that the city was not particularly comfortable with the antics of the people on Torrance Street, because even though it was just about a dozen houses, maybe it was certainly, it came up in the crime sheets a lot. So this is a pretty funny story, because I shouldn't say it's funny. Poor guy was locked in his trunk, but he's okay. He got robbed, and it took them a while to get him out of the trunk. So poor old Henri Levesque, he had quite an adventure on the end of March 1969. So I went through all of these last night, and I was quite astounded at how many of these there are. There's a story about a guy named James G. Desmond, 63, of Torrance Street. This is 1968. Now there's a family known as the Desmonds. I believe they were boxers, a black family, and one of the guys was quite well loved. Forgetting his first name, George Desmond, I believe, and he was involved in various stuff as well. But this one's named James Desmond, and I would imagine he's related to George Desmond, who eventually got shot dead in a bar in Little Burgundy. Anyway, like a couple of days after, there was a big roast for him. So the point was that he was both loved and hated insofar as they shot him, but they also loved him at a roast. Anyway, so this story is about a guy who hit a man over the head with a bottle, and he got 2 years in jail. Why? Because he had a lot of previous convictions. So that he had lived on Torrance Street, this guy. So these old newspaper articles will give you the address of various criminals as well. So it kind of was a strange policy. Now, when the Café Saint Michel closed, now the strange thing about this black area of these bars is that the government simply closed them down, and Why, it was never really made clear. In the case of Rockheads, he claimed that it was because he didn't bribe the right people. Cafe Saint Michel, I believe, was closed for various reasons. They used to flout the closing hour laws and stuff. So you had a place down there after called the Harlem Paradise. Now, the Harlem Paradise was a rocking place, and there's a lot of violent events on at the Harlem Paradise. I've written about this several places. So the Harlem Paradise on, I guess it would be the west side of Mountain Street, 772 Mountain. Here's a story about a very a brutal fight right there, and I guess the waitress was living on Torrance Street, so which is basically just right around the corner. Now, let me see what else I've got here on Torrance Street. I've got. I'm gonna give you a good one in a few minutes, but you have to sit through these first because there's another one that's going to make you laugh in a few seconds from 1956. It gives you a really good sense of what this street, this area, what the whole shape and feel of the place was about. So this is a sad one. They have a man who was strangled with his own shirt. It sounds like some sort of vagrant. You see, these are abandoned places already in 1963. A victim was found dead in a abandoned house at 1348 Torrance. And I don't know. It's just a sad story. Probably some sort of junkie who was strangled over something, but they didn't know who it was. So here's another one, a bit spicy. A fellow was found dead, asphyxiated, strangled of some sort. Albert Lefebvre, 38. His semi-nude body was found in a cupboard at 1350 Torrance Street last Saturday. So it sounds to me like, what do you call it, erotic self-asphyxiation or whatever it's called. That's my speculation, but of course we'll never know. I'm not that curious, to be quite honest. We got, hold on a second, I've got this is a pretty spicy one as well, I believe. Um, yeah. Oh boy, look what we got here. I was talking about Johnny Maguire, who was a very interesting member of the West End gang, a bit of a leader who I've written about extensively in a book I'm working on. Johnny Maguire was in a fight at the Harlem Paradise, and people were smashing each other over the head, and there were witnesses. One of them lived on Torrance Street. These articles don't say, of course, and that, nor should they, whether someone was black or white, but it kind of makes it more it would make it more interesting if you knew, uh, what these people were, because just you can't really tell by the name. It's always interesting to know what the black community was doing, because they're always just an interesting bunch. So here's a story about a guy. Oh my gosh, Victor Simons, 20 years old. He went to a party on Torrance Street in 1962. There's a couple of articles about this, and a janitor. he went to tell him to turn the music down, and Victor Simons set his dog to attack the janitor, but the dog actually didn't do any attacking at all. And Simons got even angrier because people were making fun of him. They said, "Your dog is useless." So he went and smashed this guy, the janitor, Georges Guy, 42. He beat him up very, very bad. So Simons was also a pimp, it would appear. So he was also facing charges of beating on women. So Simons was one of those old style guys, I guess, who would be seen at the Rockheads Paradise in a flashy suit and expensive, big car. So they were really like that back then, by the way, according to the descriptions I've been told. Let's see. I'm going to scroll down a bit. I went through all of these yesterday. These seem to be the same ones over and over. I'm going to show you another story now, which I think you'll quite enjoy. This is really quite a fun story. Oops. Okay, so this is from the Petit Journal, and the Petit Journal was a sort of a forgotten paper. So they went down to Torrance Street in 1956, September 1956. I'm going to read this to you. It's in French, but I'm just going to simultaneously translate. The black area of the city is, for the last 6 months, the rallying point of a prostitution network. The organizers are blacks, mostly from New York, and some Montrealers. They have a Blind Pig, which is, of course, an after-hours bar, which moves from place to place depending on the circumstances. 2 weeks ago, the Blind Pig moved from 1348 Torrance to 747 Aqueduct, which would be, of course, Lucian Alley. And so, hold on a second. Let's see. I'm also interested in this other story down here. Harry Percy. I just wrote about Harry Percy. Okay, pardon. So they're talking about Torrance Street, and they're saying that sordid things happen. The article gets sort of interesting. Hold on. The funny thing here is that this photo of a staircase is like the only photo that I could find of a house on Torrance. It's like nobody has a photo of the place. It's crazy. So that whole neighborhood is not only forgotten, but it doesn't have a picture of it. And so you've got this other one at 747 Aqueduct, which of course is long gone as well. It's demolished. So these people would come in from out of town or whatever, and I guess they would ask around, where are the hookers? Where can I have a party? And they would end up on Torrance Street. So there's a story. This journalist actually writes the license plate numbers of suspicious cars, and the paper published it, which is probably kind of not cool. But there was a Chinese restaurant nearby as well, which is referenced here, called the Chow Mein. I would imagine, yeah, it's on Mountain Street. So the Chow Mein House, they would hang out at the Chow Mein House and sort of like meet with people who are looking for hookers or a late party. So the writer himself, who doesn't put his name on the article. Oh no, pardon me, he does actually. Pierre Léger. Pierre Léger. He goes into one of the places. I guess it's in the middle of the night, and he says two black people, about 22 years old, who they sat me down on a couch and they offered me a beer, $1.25 for the beer. No, he's talking about the price. He's shocked at the fact that he has to pay so much. So the prostitute named Betsy from Chicago asked him for $12, and he claims that he doesn't have the money, but who knows what he did in real life. So that's his sort of ratting out this sort of crazy scene on Torrance Street. And I don't know if this article, if this exposition on the vice in this particular area had any impact on its eventual demolition, but I do believe I would propose that in fact it did. So you had a couple of stories like this. There was a story about a guy who was robbed on Torrance Street, and he was a 31-year-old Chicago. Okay, a 31-year-old Chicago man was a killer. He robbed a guy who, I believe in this story, had a heart attack and died. And there's a witness named Winnie Perla. She basically brought the guy down to Torrance Street in a taxi. So it sounds like Winnie Perla might have been a sex worker, and so she brought him down. She might have set him up because he ended up being attacked and robbed, and he died. So to what degree did he die of a heart attack or something else is another question. So there's another story. Now I'm having to go through these of a Polish guy who saved up his money. He moved from Poland, and after about a year working in Montreal, bought a rooming house on Torrance Street. And this is not the article I'm looking at, but what happened is there were people upstairs making noise or something. So he went to calm him down, and I believe he got pushed down the stairs, and he died. So it was quite tragic because the newspaper had earlier done photos of this guy for another story, and there he was dead. So it kind of they hyped up the fact that this guy died by getting pushed down the stairs. Um, so here's a story about two friends. This is back. This is crazy. Back in the day, two buddies from they were friends since their youth. Gerald McIntyre, who lived on Torrance Street, and Gordon Griffith, 29, lived on Guy, which is not very far. Like I said, they were friends since they were kids. They got into an argument because Griffith came to a party with two women, and McIntyre started dancing with one of them. And I shouldn't laugh because this is sad because you're not supposed to do this in real life. What happened is McIntyre was so irritated he shot his friend in blind rage, but the guy survived. So hey, all's well that ends well, right? He shot his friend over a jealous party argument. Um, Now, one thing that kind of happens when you look through these stories, okay, I've got to go farther down, is that the tenor of them eventually changes. You find that, of course, it was a rocking street in the 50s and stuff, but eventually you're going to see a change, and the older stories are about church services, and of course the names of the people living on the street are quite different. They're not, in other words, it's not a quite the same in its earlier years as it was in its later years. Let's look at this one here. Benjamin Park, 54, a native of Scotland who lived at 1329 Torrance, admitted that he stole $63. Oh, that's not a very interesting one. You see, that's the thing about modern media. They don't really write stories like that, you know. In a way, it's kind of better. The newspapers were much better back then. So it's sort of a strange anomaly. This is a bizarre story. A lady named Mrs. George Eccles. They don't actually give you her first name. They just call her by her husband's first name. 48 years old. She lived on Torrance. In actual fact, she had just moved into an eight room apartment on 1323 Torrance. Where you see 8 room apartments nowadays. And she had how many kids here? A lot of kids. 6 kids. Aged 12 to 5. So she's raising all these kids right downtown. And the story is fairly banal insofar as they just had food poisoning and had to rush to the hospital. And I guess they were fine. But just the background on what she was about is quite revealing. So we got this is the story I was mentioning. A guy named Leon Januzuski, in April 1955. He died when two guys, I guess, Lionel Springer and William Bradshaw, both 25. They were originally charged with murder. They were having a noisy drinking party at the rooming house, and of course the Polish janitor or owner, landlord, he went in to get him to calm down. Ruth Ryan, 22, was acquitted. I believe somebody who was there told me about that, and I believe Charlie Chase, the famous boxer, was there as well, because the Allo police ran a story on that same incident, and the boxer, the Charlie Chase, who was a really fascinating character. I've got him on my site. He was around helping out the situation. So Charlie Chase, good old Charlie Chase. He that's another story, but obviously he lived down in that area. Charlie Chase was once called the king of the pimps, and the funny thing was that they kept on sending him to jail, but he'd get out and he'd return to boxing, and even though he was old, he'd win the title. He'd become the champion, and really nobody wanted him to become champion, I guess, but he kept on. Here's a crazy story. You're not going to believe this one. Anybody who's watching now is going to say, wow, I'm glad I held on for this. This is March 1955. Jacques Roch, a 25-year-old taxi driver, was acquitted yesterday on a charge of abducting an 8-year-old girl. I mean, what? Roch picked up Lise Raymond in his cab July 28 on Torrance Street. So he picked up a little girl and abandoned her 4 hours later in Shadowgate Village, so near a church where she would be safe. So Roch told the judge that he loved children, was married, and he meant no harm. Overwork and drink reduced him to a state where he didn't know what he was doing. Now, this is the kind of crime that should land somebody in. I'm not really tough on crime, but that sounds like a pretty serious crime. It doesn't really make reference to whether the girl was like sexually assaulted or anything, but the judge bought it hook, line, and sinker. Armand Cloutier, he goes, uh, people's intelligence must be slipping. A lot of children are disappearing these days. Are parents going to have to tie their children up to know where they are? Your act was that of an imbecile. So he gave the guy a tongue lashing, but he didn't give him any sentence for it. He just sort of, it's just the most insane thing I've ever seen. Guy kidnaps a little girl for 4 hours. No problem. Don't do it again. So I don't think I saw this one. It's a story about a woman charged with trafficking narcotics. Back then, the drugs, I guess, were marijuana and various types of amphetamines. I guess there was a fringe heroin scene, but it wasn't very large. This actual article doesn't say what drug it was. And what amazes me is that cocaine was like not a thing. It was just not a thing. Just between about 1917 and 1973 or so, there was like no cocaine anywhere. There was just like, why didn't some gangster bring in cocaine? That to me is something I will never understand. Okay, so I can keep on going on these. You see, a guy was robbed. He was living on Torrance, or he was robbed on Torrance, and you got a lot of those. And if you just keep on going farther and farther down, the complexion of the neighborhood, the nature of what it was like, changes. So we're talking, these old newspapers really demonstrate that a lot of people lived right downtown, like people with families and children, and there was really the suburbs wasn't really like an option. Um, all the action was pretty much right near the downtown area. Let me see this one here. Accosted by two Negroes, one of them with a gun, John Hill of 1381 Torrance was relieved of his pay envelope. So that story wasn't shy to mention the ethnicity of the assailants. I suppose there was some sort of editorial meeting somewhere along the line that says let's not do that anymore. I have mixed feelings about it because it certainly brings the story to life a little more, but of course it shouldn't really be something we think about. 10-year-old assaulted in East End. So I'm afraid I don't know what this one is. I've looked through the Montreal Star articles, but I didn't look through the Gazette articles, so I can't just jump into those ones without reading them first. This one I should know. Hospital seeks friends of patient who died. Once again, it was just a random guy living on Torrance Street who died, and they needed somebody to identify him or something like that. 1940. So as you go on in time, the stories thin out. So if you want to look at this street, Torrance, once again, I'm going to show it to you on the thing. This little, how many doors? 1, 2, 3, and then this big one, plus all the ones on the south side. So we're talking about a fairly densely populated street. I can't tell how tall these buildings were, but I'm assuming they were 3 stories. And this would have been home to, what, a couple hundred people, a few hundred people, but also a very kind of booming strip right here on Mountain, where there was restaurants and bars and all sorts of things. And you notice that several of the people were who worked in these bars were living on this little street. So I'm going to wrap this up by saying, just visualize this as a sort of like an image of Montreal's development over the years. That we had a bucolic area with flowers, with fields and meadows, and a rich guy with his beautiful mansion there. And somewhere along the line, I believe I saw that it was about 1870 or 1890, you started having these other, this more density, these other buildings being put up, these working class houses, because people needed a place to stay. And the area changed over the years. It was no longer a countryside with flowers growing, but it was like the gritty urban sphere of all sorts of dynamic action and culture. Once again, you had a very interesting corner. If you could go back in time in Montreal, that would be one of the places that you would want to be. Would be corner of Saint Antoine and Mountain. You had a whole bunch of bars here. There was an excellent master's degree paper done by a McGill student, I believe, in the 30s, talking about the bars there. One was called the Nemderlock, which means colored men, spelled backwards. So that colored men bar, he described this bar that was somewhere along St. Antoine, just east of Mountain. There is no end to how fascinating this area was. And I'd have to say, it's kind of a shame to think that what we see there became what we see here. Absolutely nothing. What is this? It's a parking lot. I don't know who parks here. On the south side, it's is there some sort of industrial facility here? I'm not sure what it's being used for or who owns it, but it's a shame. It's a shame that this couldn't have been preserved or kept alive. And who knows, maybe one day it will be brought back to life because of all the development down there, but it will never be what it was, which is an exciting, dynamic, action-packed street, only 350 feet long. But just think of all of the per square foot action that happened here over the ages. It would be really mind-blowing to go back in time. Anyway, so I'm going to close this down, and I'm going to try to write something on my site Coolopolis about this, which I hope you could have a look at eventually and appreciate. Okay, so I'm closing this up, and have a good night.